And we're continuing with the 8th chapter of The Embroidered Sunset by Joan Aiken. When you have lost both a car and an aunt, which do you seek first, and how do you set about your search? Lucy stood on the pavement in a state, for once, of total indecision, empty-handed, empty-minded, bereft. She could not even, as yet, feel rage at the receptionist for her stupidity, at Adnan for his delaying tactics, at herself for letting Adnan delay her. Rage would come later. All she experienced at present was shock and loss. A sea mist had descended with the unpredictable suddenness of coastal weather. Kirby, in its cup-like hollow, was muffled and ghostly. The little painted houses climbed the hill into obscurity. The masts in harbor dwindled away, insubstantial as pencil scribbles against a white blankness. Traffic seemed to have come to a halt. The only sound was the regular melancholy cry of the lighthouse, warning ships to beware of the narrow, tricky harbor approach and the flashing, merciless cliffs. It was pointless, of course, to stand waiting in the empty mist, hoping for a miracle. Lucy set off walking at a rapid pace. Mrs. Tilney's first. Perhaps Aunt Fennel was there. Perhaps she was safe. Perhaps. All the unformulated doubts, the half-beliefs that Lucy had entertained regarding Aunt Fennel's fears, now returned, nagging and pricking. The old lady's dread projected itself onto Lucy, and assumed in the grey dimness a sudden reality, all the more threatening because of its unknown nature. The existence of that other one, which hitherto Lucy had treated with skepticism, now all at once became possible, probable, certain. She caught herself listening for the echo of footfalls behind her on the cobbled hill, and shook her head impatiently. Dear Max, here we are, caught up in a proper old horror comic. All we need now is an eerie shriek and some vampire talons reaching out of the broom. Oh, Max, why the devil did I let myself go off junketing with that smooth-tongued Turk? I thought I could find out some more about Aunt Fennel's pictures, and who had them. No, but that's not the whole truth. I thought it would be fun. He seemed genuinely friendly. And it had been fun, too, she thought angrily, reaching Mrs. Tilney's gate at a half-run. Only now all the pleasure in retrospect had turned sour and seemed a heartless piece of irresponsibility, while the old lady might be lost in wandering. But perhaps she was safe all the time at Mrs. Tilney's. Suddenly very tired, Lucy leaned against the door jamb, pressing the rusty bell. For a long time there was no answer, but surely somebody must be in the house. All the aged and infirm residents could not simultaneously have decided to go out in such murky and inclement weather. Perhaps they were too deaf to hear the bell. But what about Mrs. Tilney herself? At last the door was opened by a frail man whom Lucy remembered to have been among the other motionless gargoyles ranged in front of the TV set. He peered suspiciously round the edge of the door, ostentatiously pulling a fawn-plaid muffler up to his ears against the wreaths of fog that instantly began drifting in among the umbrella stands and bicycles in the crowded hallway. "Is Miss Culpepper here?" Lucy asked. His face remained quite blank. He seemed either deaf or withdrawn into some unapproachable region of himself. Having let Lucy in, he evidently felt that his responsibility was ended and limped back into the parlor. Lucy, following, scanned the group, who were now seated patiently like old dogs round a fireless hearth, watching the blank TV. Apparently, it was not yet time for the evening's programs to begin. Aunt Fennel was not among them. "Is Miss Culpepper upstairs?" Lucy asked loudly. One or two heads slowly shook, either in non-comprehension or denial. "Well, could you tell me where Mrs. Tilney is?" "Isn't she in the kitchen?" an elderly voice presently volunteered doubtfully. "The kitchen's where she is mostly afternoons." If so, why not answer the bell, Lucy thought, but she thanked the speaker and retreated, picking a cautious way between thin old legs and out-thrust white socks. The kitchen, filled with the usual miasma of stale frying and unclean aged animals, also contained the solution to why Mrs. Tilney did not answer the bell. She slept in a basket chair among her pets, her head nodding forward at an uncomfortable angle, a half bottle of Gordon's on the floor beside her. From time to time she let out a rattling snore. The room was in its accustomed state of filth. A large wash basin full of potatoes stood on the table, waiting to be peeled, for supper presumably. Looking at the empty, sleeping face with its open mouth, slack and dribbling, its broken purple veins, crumpled cheeks, an air of total surrender, Lucy experienced a disconcerting reversal of feeling. Instead of a drunken harpy who made a living by exploiting poor old people, in worse case than herself, Mrs. Tilney suddenly appeared ill, exhausted, pitiable. Lucy looked with a kind of anguish at her gnarled, swollen hands, shiny with grease from washing dishes. There seemed no sense in rousing her from a sleep of such exhaustion. Besides, from the moment of entering the house, Lucy had felt in her bones that Aunt Fennel was not there. However, she climbed the stairs to make sure, negotiated the guardian Venus on the upper floor, and looked into the room where Aunt Fennel slept with the two other old ladies. Nobody there, a handkerchief and a spare tin of raspberry leaf pastries, and a spare tin of raspberry leaf pastilles lay on a chair where they had been discarded that morning. The room smelt of fusty old ladies. Standing by the bed, wondering what to do next, Lucy had an unexpected burning stab of pain in her side. She could not decide whether its origin was mental or physical. It felt like the clutch of grief on her heart. Not only grief, shame. I have lost my family, she thought, and it was due to my own stupidity and carelessness. Two hot, difficult tears found their way down her cheeks. Impatiently, she shook herself, hurried downstairs. Mrs. Tilney still slept. The old gargoyles still waited trustfully in front of the blank screen. Lucy let herself out into the fog. Her obvious next step was to call the police. She started hurrying down the steeply tilted little terraced streets, hunting for telephone booths, which seemed scarcer here than red herrings that grow in the wood. Better make for the harbor and the shopping district. She wished she had not left her duffel coat in little PHO when she went off with Adnan to the fun fair. The sea mist struck dank and chill through her cotton shirt and jeans. Where could Aunt Fennel be? What could she be doing? In the last few days, the old lady had become so completely trustingly geared to Lucy's directing force that it seemed almost impossible to imagine her suddenly taking independent action, going off into the fog on some ploy of her own. Down to the drugstore for powdered elm bark or lettuce soup? No, because all the stores were shut. Early closing day, and Aunt Fennel knew that perfectly well, for she had reminded Lucy to buy writing paper and shampoo before lunch. Unexpectedly, a tall black shape, like a 9-pin, loomed up out of the dimness. With immense relief, Lucy realized that it was a policeman, crunching ponderously along, pausing to peer into foggy alleys and through the windows of parked cars. She hailed him hopefully. "Can you please help me? I've lost an old lady in the car." "An old lady in the car?" He scrutinized her with not unreasonable doubt. "What kind of car, then?" "A plum-colored Austin A30. What kind of an old lady? Lucy thought. You might as well ask. A unique old lady, an ambiguous old lady, an irreplaceable old lady. Was the old lady driving the car? The policeman asked. Even in her distress, Lucy found it hard not to chuckle at the thought of Aunt Fennel, green eyeshade in place, white linen hat pulled well down, careening off through Kirby at the wheel of the little PHO. "No, that's not so mysterious. You see, the two mishaps seem to have been quite separate." "Where had you left the vehicle?" "On Market Street, outside Fawcett, the dentist's. And the old lady was inside the dentist's." "Oh, well, if you left the vehicle in Market Street, it will probably have been towed away by the police." The constable sounded reproving. He put away his notebook. "That's a no parking zone, didn't you know? Didn't you see the double lines? Your best plan is to go down to the station and to make inquiries there." "The station? The police station, round the other side of the harbour. That's what you ought to do." Lucy felt an easing of her heart. This seemed such a rational explanation that she wondered why it had not occurred to her already. "And the old lady?" "And the old lady, do you think they towed her away too?" "Oh." "And the old lady, do you think they towed her away too?" His face remained blank and unresponsive. "Is this old lady subject to fainting fits or blackouts?" "Not so far as I know. She's my aunt, Miss Culpepper." Out came the notebook again. "How do you spell that?" Lucy spelt it for him, slowly, twice. but noticed with irritation that he still got it wrong as he laboriously wrote it down. "Well, you'd better ask at the station about her, too. That's all I can advise," he then said unhelpfully. "If there's been any report of an accident, they'll be able to tell you there." "Well, thanks," Lucy said without joy. "What's the quickest way to the police station?" He gave her directions, but seemed quite surprised when she followed them, as if he suspected her of perpetuating some dubious teenage joke. Kirby Police Station was solidly built of granite in a Rococo style. It looked like a setting for the kind of grim fairy tale in which people are shoveled into ovens or rolled downhill in barrels of nails. But the middle-aged sergeant who interviewed Lucy seemed not unfriendly. "You lost the car, miss, at Pink Austin, registration PHO 898A. Can I see your license, please?" Lucy handed over her papers and waited with the usual feelings of anxiety and guilt, while he studied them for a long time in silence. How stupid it is, she thought it irrelevantly, that society always makes one feel guilty for the wrong thing. I am to blame for losing Aunt Fennel, but if they punish me, it will be for doing something that I didn't even know was forbidden. Wilby's always saying that the tax authorities ignore his legitimate expenses and oblige him to invest a lot of false ones, though that's not a very good analogy. Whatever society did to him, I bet Wilby would be as crooked as a pair of dividers. Why did I think of him? Having entered her mind, the thought of Wilby would not leave, but stuck there like a burr. She imagined how angry, how disinclined to help he would be if he knew of her present predicament. You've got yourself into a jam, princess. You get yourself out again. Of all the goddamn stupid things to do. Getting into parking trouble abroad. If there's one thing I cannot abide, it's stupidity. No, I will not pay your fine." She wondered how much the fine would be if there were a choice of fine or prison. The question seemed trivial compared with her worry about Aunt Fennel, except that if she had to go to prison, who would look for the old lady? She was on the point of bursting out with this when the sergeant handed back her documents and turned and shouted over his shoulder, "Harold!" A distant voice answered indistinguishably, "A pink A20, registration PHO 898A, left in Market Street 2 p.m. We got the owner here." Then turning back to Lucy, he said, "Well, we won't be hard on you this time, as you haven't been in this country long, but don't do it again, mind." "You're not going to send me to prison?" She could hardly believe her ears. The sergeant grinned. "Not this time." "And you've really got the car?" "It's down in the yard at the rear." "What about my aunt? Is there any hope you've got her up your sleeve, too?" The return of little PHO had given Lucy new heart. She felt like a snail that has had its shell restored. "Oh, now, I'm afraid we can't work miracles, young lady. We'll keep a lookout for your aunt. That's all we can promise. Can you give me a description of her?" Lucy did so, but the sergeant shook his head. "Kirby's full of old ladies like that." "You're telling me? But where could she have got to?" Lucy cried in despair. "She's nearly deaf. She's almost blind. She walks so slowly." Are those things the truth? She suddenly wondered. Have I a totally false conception of Aunt Fennel? Has she been skillfully deceiving me all this time? "Probably gone into Joe Lyons for a cup of tea," the sergeant suggested, bracingly, shepherding Lucy to the door. It was plain that, while sympathetic, he thought she was making a great pother over a trifle, for which some perfectly reasonable explanation would soon present itself. "Now you just step round the back, miss, and pick up your car, sign this, and give it to the constable on duty there, and then if I were you, I'd go up to the old lady's lodgings again. 10 to 1 she's found her way home by now, but keep in touch with us, and I'll put out a call for her. Oh, and miss—" "Yes, if you find she has turned up at home, you won't forget to let us know, will you? We don't want to go wasting time and manpower looking for someone that isn't lost, do we?" He smiled at Lucy benevolently. "Now, don't you worry. If she's been in any accident, we'll see her soon enough." And what good will that do? Thought Lucy glumly, going down some back steps to a dusky, mist-filled yard where little PHO stood humbly among a lot of police jaguars. A traffic policeman was waiting impatiently to oversee the removal, so Lucy did not wait to put on her coat, which was bundled on the floor at the back with the blanket and sleeping bag, but switched on lights and heater and hurriedly drove away. I'll go back to Mrs. Tilney's first, she thought. That was good advice, but if Aunt Fennel still isn't there, then what shall I do? By the time she reached Reservoir Street, true dark had descended, thickened by the fog. She drew up outside Mrs. Tilney's. The massive pile of junk in the front yard was visible by the dim, diffused light of a street lamp 10 yards off, and then reached into the back for her duffel coat. Her hand encountered something warm, which moved. Lucy had had a long, tiring, anxious day. Her nerves were not in a good state. She let out a yelp of pure fright and snatched her hand back. A timid, quavering voice said, "Is that Lucy?" "Aunt Fennel, my goodness, is that you?" Hardly able to believe it, Lucy tipped forward to the passenger seat and scrambled into the rear. Feeling around among the tangle of coat, blanket, and naps and kapok-lined bag, she found a hand, an arm, a bony shoulder. The old lady was tightly jammed in the small gap between the front and rear seats, with the duffel coat pulled over her head. Gingerly, carefully, Lucy helped extract her from this awkward slot and eased her on to the back seat. Even now, she could hardly believe that Aunt Fennel was really there. She hugged the old lady, felt her up and down, hugged her again, and hugged her again. "But Aunt Fennel, what were you doing there? Did you go to sleep and slip down? What happened?" "I've been worried to death about you. I thought somebody must have abducted you. Didn't you wake when the police towed the car away?" Two frail old arms came out and went round her neck. A claw-like finger was laid across her lips. "Hush, dearie, where are we?" Aunt Fennel was whispering. Lucy suddenly realized that she was trembling and tense as a bowstring. Something had frightened her badly, was frightening her still. "We're outside Mrs. Tilney's. Do you want to go in? Pack up your things." "Is there anybody in the street, dearie?" Lucy scanned the short, dimly lit terrace. "Not a soul." "Let's wait a little while, just the same. Just in case." Aunt Fennel was silent a moment. Lucy could feel the pounding and fluttering of her heart, even through the lower coat, cable-stitched cardigan, serviceable jersey dress, corset, vest, and Liberty bodice. Or was it Lucy's own heart, thumping in a swollen acceleration of fear? "You see, dearie," Aunt Fennel was whispering, "I saw him." Who did you see? That other one. I'd come out to the dentist and you weren't there." There was no reproach in her mild voice. "I'm sorry, Aunt Fen. I was a pig not to get back in time. It didn't matter, dearie. You left the car unlocked, so I got in and sat in it." That was sensible. Lucy hugged the old lady again. Finding the car taken, she had cursed herself for her negligence in leaving it unlocked. What a stroke of good fortune this had turned out to be. "Was that when you saw that other one?" "Yes, dearie. I was sitting in the car when he came along. He went into the dentist, but he didn't stop. He came out and stood looking up and down the street. He didn't see me, though. Well, of course, he wouldn't expect me to be sitting in a car, you see. Didn't look." "How far away from you was he?" "Just along the pavement." "You were able to recognize him?" "Oh, yes, dearie. He has a special way of walking, bouncy. I'd know it if I'd met him in China. And those things he smokes, too. I smelt them. I'd know them anywhere." Professional observation, Lucy thought, the artist's eye. After her own recent agony of anxiety, she was more inclined to take Aunt Fennel's story seriously. This sounded like genuine evidence. "What happened then?" "He went off along the street, and I hid down behind the car seat, in case he came back again looking for me." "But Aunt Fennel, why are you so positive he'd be looking for you?" "Why else would he be in Kirby, dear?" "I don't know." "Doesn't he live here?" "Oh, no, dear. Goodness only knows where he lives." "What does he do? What's his profession?" "I don't know, dear. If I did, I wouldn't tell. And if I did, I wouldn't tell you." The blank end again. There was no getting past it. "But Aunt Fennel, what did you think when the police came and moved the car? Did you think it was him taking it or what?" "No, dear, I heard the voices. I was worried, of course," the old lady said simply. "But I knew you would come and find me in the end." Sometimes Lucy felt unequal to Aunt Fennel. This was one of those times. She swallowed, drew in a deep breath, squeezed the old lady's hand, and after a moment said, "Well, I'd better finish those bits of packing and we'll be off. Do you want to stay in the car? I can lock you in." "I think that would be best, dear." "Shall I say goodbye to Mrs. Tilney and the others for you?" Occasionally Aunt Fennel showed an unexpected vein of calm unsentimentality. "No, dearie, they didn't mean anything to me, and we shan't miss each other. Just you bring my things out." On the long, dark drive up to Appleby, Lucy, partly to break the silence of undischarged question and emotional fatigue that had fallen between them, risked the topic that had been in her mind for days. "Aunt Fennel?" The old lady came out of a bit of a fit of abstraction. "Yes, lovey. You knew my father quite well when he was young, before he was married." There was another considerable pause, and Aunt Fennel said, "Yes, I did, dear, quite well. Both those boys, their father and mother died when they were in their teens, you see, so I was their only relative." There was some qualification in her tone. Lucy could not analyze it. She went on, "I'd like it very much if you'd tell me a bit about my father. Nobody ever has, you see, except Uncle Wilby, and everything he says sounds like a great big jealous lie." Aunt Fennel was silent for another long time. "There's not really much to tell, dearie." "There must be something," Lucy persisted. "Well, dearie, I'll tell you another day," Aunt Fennel said, with the same light, unexpected decisiveness. "But not just now, not this evening. After all that fright, I'm a little bit tired." Feeling justly rebuked, Lucy drove on and over the dark moorland. Guessing that the old people retired early, she had expected Wildfell Hall to be cloaked in repose and obscurity, but this was far from the case. Windows on several floors were lit and uncurtained. A considerable bustle prevailed. "There you are!" Mrs. Marsham exclaimed, coming into the portico as Lucy helped Aunt Fennel out of the car. "I thought you said you'd be here at tea time." "We were held up, sorry." Lucy had no intention of going into explanations. Mrs. Marsham did not wait for them. "Well, now you've come, you can make yourself useful. I've put your aunt in a small bedroom, with one other old lady in the first floor. She'd better go straight to bed." "She hasn't had any supper," Lucy said coldly. "Well, you can take up a tray to her room." Lucy was ready to rebel against this high-handed treatment, but Aunt Fennel interposed mildly. "I'd like that, dearie. I really am rather tired." Swallowing her resentment, Lucy helped Aunt Fennel upstairs to a small, pleasant room, probably once a dressing room, which looked out on the front sweep. One of the two beds was already occupied. As soon as Mrs. Marsham had left them with their luggage, instructing Lucy to come to the kitchen as soon as she had settled her aunt, the inmate of the second bed shot upright. Lucy recognized one of the two old ladies they had seen quarreling about the ginger cat, the small, beady-eyed, bald one. Childock. That was the name. "Had measles?" she inquired importantly. "Yes, both of us." "Why has anyone come down with it?" Lucy rapidly extracted and disposed Aunt Fennel's immediate necessities, pulled her cubicle curtain, and turned back the gay knitted patchwork bed cover. "Here's your nightie, Aunt Fennel. I'll run and get you a hot water bottle in a moment." "My goodness, yes, 4 or 5 of 'em have temperatures and 2 has rashes. Matrons in a rare old taking," Mrs. Chittick said with satisfaction at being able to convey such dramatic tidings. "She hardly knows where to put 'em all for quarantine. And that Mrs. Crabtree's very bad. Got pneumonia with it. She ought to go to hospital, really, I heard the doctor say, but she's too ill to be moved." Lucy felt more sympathy with the hand-pressed Mrs. Marsham, and accelerated Aunt Fennel's slow progress into bed. "There you are, Aunt Fen. Hot bottle, rosemary, raspberry tablets. You know where the bathroom is. One door along. Now, I'll just nip down and get your supper tray. Have you had yours?" she asked Mrs. Chittick. "Yes, dear, thank you. The rooms across from the landing are the quarantines. Mind you don't go up to the next floor. That's matron's private quarters. She won't allow anyone up there." "Where were you living before you came here, dearie?" "Dear?" inquired Mrs. Chittick of Aunt Fennel, obviously hoping for a good gossip. But Aunt Fennel took off her hearing aid and hung it with ostentatious care over the end of her bed. "I'm afraid I'm nearly stone deaf," she said loudly and slowly. "I shan't be able to hear you right across the room." Mrs. Chittick sank back, disappointed to her transistor radio as Lucy left the room. In the kitchen, Mrs. Marsham was darting efficiently about, boiling, sterilizing, preparing hot drinks. "Help yourself to whatever you please out of the larder for your aunt," she told Lucy. "Do you mind waiting a bit for your own meal? I'm all behind with the bed patients, and I'm expecting the doctor back from Mrs. Crabtree." Ha, Lucy thought sourly. I bet he won't like having to come all the way up here at this time of night, him and his family planning clinics. She prepared a tray and a hot drink for Aunt Fennel, and having seen her supplied, was kept on the run by Mrs. Marsham for a couple of hours, taking aspirin and drinks to feverish patients, remaking beds, escorting tottering old inmates to the bathroom, and emptying the slops of others who were too feeble to get up. Real F. Nightingale stuff, she said to herself. Well, you asked for it and you got it. Dear Max, you wouldn't approve of this, but really, it's as well someone should be doing the job. There don't seem many other candidates. Apart from herself, the help seemed to consist of a sulky girl from Kirby, who grumbled that it was really her evening off, and she didn't know what Mum would say, she was sure. Lucy was impressed, nonetheless, at how immaculate Mrs. Marsham succeeded in keeping Wildfell Hall despite the present crisis, despite the evidently impertinent and unreliable nature of her hired help. Every room she entered was spotless and tidy. Floors shone with polish. The old people were plainly well fed and well cared for. What a contrast to Mrs. Tilney's ramshackle establishment. And yet, were the inmates really happy? There seemed an air of tension and anxiety about the place, but that could easily be attributable, Lucy conceded, to the epidemic, or perhaps it was purely her own subjective reaction. It had been a long, hard day, and it was not over yet. At 10:30, the front doorbell rang. Lucy and Mrs. Marsham were trying to shepherd back to his own bed a slightly delirious old man who had been found wandering down the hallway, under the impression that he must hurry or he would miss the night train to Euston. You answer it, panted Mrs. Marsham. I've got him now. Come on, Mr. Cordwainer. I've booked a sleeper, and they're keeping it for you. But they won't hold the train forever. I just hope Adnan's brought plenty of sedation. It's going to take a king-size dose to keep this one down. Grinning, Lucy ran downstairs and opened the front door to Adnan. At the sight of him standing between the pillars of the portico, her amusement faded. She remembered too vividly the heart-wrenching anxiety of that afternoon. Ah, so you are all safely installed. Dear Lucy Snow, he greeted her. How delightful that is. Quite reconciles me to the need for this uncongenial visit. And the aunt, she is snugly bedded down, I trust? No thanks to you, Lucy said icily. His black brows shot up. They were thick, like furry caterpillars. Tonight he wore a sheepskin car coat, with exotic embroidery over a black whipcord boiler suit, and Beau Brummel white stock. Despite her anger with him, Lucy could not resist looking to see if there were spurs on his black boots. There were not, but only just not. She felt he might have left them in the car. No thanks to me, he said, but Mrs. Marsham leaned over the banisters and called in a low voice. Come up, Doctor, will you? I'd like you to look at Mrs. Crabtree right away. There was a long conference over Mrs. Crabtree, whose state, apparently, was causing grave anxiety. While this went on, Lucy, who had not been allowed into Mrs. Crabtree's sick room, carried drinks to 2 other feverish patients and hot water bottles to a whole series of unmeasled inmates who had been roused by all the disturbance and were fretfully complaining of cold, for the moorland night had turned sharp, and found a store of extra blankets and dealt them round. She also settled Aunt Fennel for the night. I am glad you brought me here, dearie, the old lady said drowsily. This seems to be a very well-run place, and I'm sure I shall be happy here. With a wry grin over this, Lucy wondered where her own sleeping quarters were, and how soon she was likely to get to them. About to leave the room, she was startled by a whisper from the other corner. Mrs. Crabtree gone yet? Gone? Gone. Died. What makes you so sure she's going to die? Lucy snapped. Matron won't take any pains to save her, Mrs. Chittick whispered with assurance. Not after Alice kicking her blessed pusscat like that. Besides, they was having terrible words last night. Heard 'em myself. Alice was very bad in the night. She slept in here, see? She asked me to go to Matron for something to make her better. You go yourself, I said. You were the one said I took cheese off the trolley. Spiteful old hag, Lucy thought. She went upstairs to matron's room. That's not allowed, says I to myself. There's bound to be trouble. Sure enough, a few minutes after I heard 'em at it, hammer and tongs. You know that you're not allowed up here, says matron. Couldn't you wait 20 minutes till I come on night rounds? I'd been dead by then with this pain, says Alice. Your evening rounds wouldn't ha' done me much good then, would they? None of your impertinence, my lady, says matron, or you can whistle for your medicine. Oh, I couldn't help laughing. You mark my words, matron won't take any pains to keep her alive. Removing herself without regret from these ghoulish opinions, Lucy carried a load of bed linen downstairs and stuffed it into the Bendix. Shortly afterwards, Mrs. Marsham appeared looking harassed. Make a pot of tea for me and the doctor, would you, while we finish the inoculations? We'll be down in 5 minutes or so. I expect you could do with a cup yourself. I would prefer eggnog, Adnan called softly and authoritatively over the banisters. That is, if Miss Lucy knows how to make it. Sure I know, muttered Lucy, going to the pantry for eggs. Certain you wouldn't like a 4-course meal while I'm at it. However, on reflection, eggnog seemed a good idea. She was hungry herself, but too tired for solid food. She found eggs, milk, and a simple but effective electric mixer, like a power corkscrew. Mrs. Marsham, no doubt, because of the unreliable labor force at her disposal, had equipped her establishment with the most superior mechanical aids. There was a deep freeze room, a self-cleaning oven, an infrared grill, an electric scrubber, polisher, potato peeler. Lucy wondered how often they all went wrong. Eggnog. Eggnog, aha, delicious. She really does know how to make it, said Adnan, materializing in the kitchen doorway. I suppose you would not have a drop of cognac to put in it, dear Mrs. Marsham? Without replying, Mrs. Marsham unlocked a cupboard and brought out a bottle of Martell. Would you like some? She said to Lucy. I must say, you've been a big help this evening. Don't know how we'd have managed without you. The words were civil enough, but her tone and her eyes lacked warmth. She's the sort who hates to be under an obligation or beaten in an argument, Lucy thought. Won't admit she could be wrong. There was a thump and a groan from upstairs. If that's old Mr. Cordwainer fallen out of bed again, Mrs. Marsham exclaimed angrily, I'll really give him what for this time. She ran up the stairs, the light of battle in her eye, brisk as if she were just beginning the day. Wonderful woman, remarked Adnan, sipping his eggnog. How glad I am that I am not married to her, even as only one of the 4 wives permitted by the Koran. She would be a pain in the neck. He glanced sidelong at Lucy for her reactions to this, but she, having finished her own drink, was silently stacking crockery in the dishwasher. Dear Miss Lucy, I appear to be under a cloud. Why is that? Tell me, pray. Placing his hand on his heart, he sang softly, I am under a cloud, bloody but unbowed, yet 5 times to the girl I cry, why, dear Lucy, tell me why. I hope you catch the words worthy in reference. When I came to the north of England, I was careful to read up on all the appropriate literature. Sweet child of nature, sweet Lucy, child of nature, tell me, how have I displeased you? When I got back this afternoon, I found that my aunt had left the dentist hours before. I couldn't find her for ages, and I was terribly worried about her. Now, how could I have known how long Fawcett would take? Adnan asked reasonably. Also, you said it would be quite okay to leave my car in Market Street, whereas in fact the police towed it away, and I had a lot of trouble and was lucky not to be found. He burst out laughing. Alas, humble apologies. Now I see why I am in the rogues' gallery along with the rapacious uncle who wishes to grab all the paintings and stop paying the pension. What is his name, by the way? The same as mine. Not that it seems any concern of yours. Why do you ask? My father, a man of great financial acumen, in the old days he would have been called a pasha, brought me some shares in an American firm called Culpepper's Pharmaceutical. They continue to rise, and I am very happy about them. Would that be your uncle's concern? Yes, that's Uncle Wilby. Lucy grinned a private grin into the bowels of the Splash Master. Please turn this way when you smile. I do so admire the diagonal incisors. And also, tell me what you are smiling about. I suppose Uncle's firm is so prosperous because it peddles heroin grown by poor exploited Turks. I don't know about the heroin, though I do know my uncle. I wouldn't be a bit surprised. Then why the smile? Share this piece of irresistible humor with me. Think how hard I have been working, how much I need cheering. Untrustworthy Adnan might be, a self-seeker, a dark horse, but there was no doubt that he would also be the person to appreciate an item of information that had caused Lucy exquisite amusement. When she learned by chance a year ago, her only frustration since then had been that there was not a single soul in whom she could confide in. Oh, well, it's just my uncle, you see, is so very respectable. He lives a lovely executive and golf-playing wife with my aunt, is well-born and knows the right people, and my cousin knows even righter people and is scheduled to marry some Rockefeller. So, all this is admirable. I see nothing to laugh at. All this admirable propriety is based on the immense sales of a little article called Hyman Holsterette. Adnan exploded with laughter. Ha ha ha! H, I see. No wonder this worthy man now wishes to launch out as a collector of the arts. And do the aunt and cousin know on what their prosperity rests? Goodness, no. But how did you discover? Oh, some business acquaintance of my uncle's that he hadn't seen in a long time happened to meet him once when he'd had to take me to Boston to get my eyes tested, and addressed him as H, and my uncle shut him up pretty smartly. Those aren't my uncle's initials, so they kind of stuck in my mind. And then I picked up the information from a boy at summer camp that this particular article was called a double H. It all clicked into place. You have no real proof, however. Oh, yes, I have, because then I pretended I knew all about it to Russ, my uncle's personal assistant, and he was annoyed and kind of scared, too. Said I'd better not let Willoughby find out I knew, or there'd be real trouble. So you did not? No. Not that he could do anything. Adnan shook his head at her. They followed from the snowy banks, those footmarks one by one, into the middle of the plank, and further there were none. Lucy, your talent for finding out things is liable to get you pushed under a train one of these days, unless you keep it in check. You are too shrewd a girl for your own good, I sadly fear. While you are resident in this establishment, I should particularly warn you. Mrs. Marsham came back into the kitchen, rolling down her immaculate sleeves. Still here, she said, not very hospitably, to the doctor. I thought you'd gone already. They're all settled now. But you'll be up in the morning, early to see Mrs. Crabtree? Yes, he said, sighing. She might make it. She has a tough constitution, that one. Have you given me back the box of bee serum? It's by your bag there. Ah, thank you. I will say good night, then. Good night, he said formally to Lucy, and walked out through the hall with his rapid, assured step. The front door slammed, and they heard the Alpha roar off down the drive. Do you want me to spell you on night nursing? Do you want me to spell you on night nursing? Asked Lucy, stifling a yawn. No, thanks. I have my son staying upstairs. He'll give me a hand if necessary. Come along and I'll show you your room. It's in one of the cottages, I'm afraid. With all the quarantines, I haven't a single room free in this house. We might as well go round in your car. Bring your bag. Lucy was not pleased at being put in a different building from Aunt Fennel, but saw that there was no help for it. Guided by Mrs. Marsham, she drove round to the rear of Wildfell Hall and on across the park for a couple of 100 yards to a cobbled stable yard. That one is your cottage, Mrs. Marsham said. The next is to Gardner's. The third is empty at present. I've made up a bed for you in the top front room. Come over in the morning at 7, will you? Can you wake, or would you like to be cold? There's an internal phone. I can wake normally, but it's been a long day. I guess you'd better call me. Thanks. Very well. You can keep your car in the yard here. Would you mind leaving your lights on till I get back to the house? I forgot to bring a torch. Good night. While Mrs. Marsham walked swiftly back along the footpath, Lucy went upstairs and investigated her new quarters. The cottage was small, 2 up and 2 down. Similar layout to High Beck. The furnishing was sketchy, but adequate, and a tiny bathroom had been squeezed in at the head of the stairs. Looking out of its window into the yard below, she saw a man walk into the headlight beam. He turned and looked toward the open door of Lucy's cottage, then followed Mrs. Marsham toward the big house. Lucy stared after him in blank astonishment. Utterly unlikely though it seemed, and despite the fact that she had last seen him in Boston, 3,000 miles away, and knew no reason why he should suddenly turn up in Yorkshire, she would have been almost ready to swear that the person following Mrs. Marsham was her Uncle Wilby's assistant, Russ McClartney. She went downstairs, automatically switched off her car's lights, and walked up, bolted the door of the house, washed, and fell into bed. Outside on the moor, she could hear owls calling. Russ. It didn't make sense. Then could Russ be Aunt Fennel's other one, her nightmare pursuer? No. Ridiculous. Besides, at the time when Miss Beatrice Howe had fallen to a doom, allegedly pushed by that other one, Russ had been glumly escorting Aunt Rose and Coral on a trip through the Florida Everglades. Russ, that other one. Adding on with his warning, Lucy, Lucy, you are too shrewd for your own good. Well, you are resident in this establishment. Too shrewd. Dear Max, I can't make head or tail of it. Too complicated, too many things to worry about. I'll never get to sleep, Lucy thought, burrowed her face into the pillow, and slept. And that is the end of chapter 8.